Pack your bags. This isn't your home. Lauren said it while passing the mashed potatoes, as if she were asking me to pass the salt, and for a moment I truly believed I had misheard her. That grief was playing tricks on my ears the way it had all week since we buried my husband of 42 years. But then she looked directly at me across the mahogany dining table. Thomas had refinished himself back in 1998 and repeated, slower this time, you should start packing tonight. Daniel didn't correct her. He didn't even look surprised. He just kept his eyes on his plate, cutting his roast into careful, even pieces, the same way he used to when he was a little boy trying to avoid a scolding. The house felt too large without Thomas in it. Too quiet. The air still carried the faint scent of the cologne he wore every Sunday to church. His reading glasses were still on the end table beside his recliner, folded neatly as if he might walk in at any moment and ask what was for dessert. I folded my napkin and set it beside my plate. My hands did not shake. I understand, I said, because that was easier than asking my only son why he was allowing his wife to remove me from the home his father and I had paid off 15 years ago. Lauren leaned back in her chair, satisfied, as though a long-awaited inconvenience had finally been handled. It's just practical, she added. Daniel and I need our own space. And legally this was Dad's house. Was. The word landed harder than the rest. Thomas had been gone exactly 9 days. 9 mornings of waking up and reaching for someone who was no longer there. 9 nights of staring at the ceiling fan spinning slowly above a bed that suddenly felt twice its normal size. I stood up and carried my plate to the sink. No one offered to help. The kitchen window overlooked the backyard where Thomas had built a cedar deck with his own hands, measuring every board twice, insisting on precision. He used to say a home wasn't walls and a roof. It was the promise that the people inside would always belong there. I wondered what he would think if he could see his wife being told she did not. You can take the guest room downstairs for now, Lauren continued, her voice light, almost cheerful. It'll make the transition easier. Transition. As if I were moving into assisted living instead of being dismissed from the house where I had raised my child, hosted every Thanksgiving dinner for 3 decades, and planted the oak tree that now stretched 30 feet high along the fence line. Daniel finally spoke, but not to defend me. It's probably best, Mom, he said quietly. The upkeep is a lot. I nodded. I had managed the upkeep through snowstorms that dumped 12 inches overnight, through summers when the air conditioner quit in July heat that reached 95 degrees, through every cracked tile and leaking faucet. But I did not argue. Grief has a way of stripping arguments down to their bones. I walked upstairs slowly, my palm gliding along the banister Thomas had varnished so many times the wood felt like glass. Our bedroom door was half open. Inside, the bed was still made on his side. The indentation on his pillow barely faded. I sat on the edge and looked around at the framed photographs on the dresser. Our wedding day in 1981, Daniel in his Little League uniform, family vacations at Lake Michigan where Thomas insisted on teaching everyone how to bait a hook properly. I did not cry. Instead, I reached for the small brass key inside my jewelry box, the one Thomas had pressed into my hand last winter after a quiet conversation I hadn't fully understood at the time. Just in case, he had said. I slipped the key into my sweater pocket and stood up. Downstairs, I could hear Lauren laughing softly at something on her phone. The house sounded different already, as if it were adjusting to a new owner. I picked up an empty suitcase from the closet and placed it on the bed. If they wanted me to pack, I would pack. But not because I had nowhere to belong. And not because this wasn't my home. The suitcase lay open on the bed exactly where I had placed it, its zipper teeth slightly crooked from years of use. And I stood in the center of the room trying to decide what a woman takes when she is being told to leave her own life behind. Outside the window, the late afternoon sun stretched across the backyard deck Thomas had built, casting long shadows over the oak tree we planted the year Daniel left for college. I could hear Lauren moving dishes in the kitchen downstairs, the sharp clink of porcelain against porcelain, the ordinary sounds of someone already rearranging a space to suit her preferences. I opened the top drawer of my dresser and lifted out a folded wool sweater Thomas had given me one Christmas when the temperature dropped below 20 degrees and the furnace had struggled to keep up. It still held the faint scent of cedar from the closet. I placed it carefully into the suitcase. Not because I needed it, but because I wanted to choose what left this house with me. The hallway outside our bedroom felt narrower than it had the week before. Daniel's voice drifted upward, low and steady, discussing mortgage rates and property taxes as if I were already gone. I moved toward the nightstand and picked up Thomas's watch, the silver one he wore every day for nearly 3 decades. I turned it over in my hand, feeling the small scratch near the clasp from the time he slipped on the driveway during an ice storm. He had laughed about it afterward, saying even concrete could not compete with Michigan winters. I set the watch back down. Some things belonged where they were. I walked to the closet and reached up to the top shelf where a small metal lockbox sat behind a stack of old photo albums. My fingers brushed against the cool surface of the brass key in my sweater pocket. I did not open the lockbox yet. Instead, I carried it to the bed and placed it beside the suitcase. Downstairs, Lauren's voice rose slightly, bright and confident, explaining to Daniel how the downstairs guest room would make a perfect home office once it was cleared out. Cleared out. I closed my eyes for a moment and remembered the day we converted that room into a guest suite for my mother after her surgery. How Thomas insisted on installing softer lighting and a handrail in the bathroom so she would feel safe. The house had always adjusted to care for someone. It had never rejected anyone. I knelt beside the bed and slid out a wooden memory box from underneath, the one filled with birthday cards, old report cards, and crayon drawings Daniel made in elementary school. On the front of one drawing he had written in uneven letters, "I love you, Mom, you make the best pancakes." I traced the faded marker lines with my thumb. Somewhere between those mornings at the stove and this evening at the dining table, something had shifted. I stood and carried the memory box to the suitcase but did not place it inside. Not yet. Instead, I walked toward the window and looked out at the neighborhood street where children used to ride their bikes in circles during summer break. The mailbox at the end of the driveway still bore our last name in black lettering. Collins. Thomas had insisted on repainting it every few years so it would not fade. I reached into my pocket and wrapped my fingers around the brass key. Thomas had not been a man who acted without thought. If he handed me something and said just in case, there had been a reason. I turned away from the window and finally opened the metal lockbox. Inside lay a thick envelope and a set of documents neatly clipped together. I did not read them yet. I simply rested my hand on top of the papers and allowed myself one slow, steady breath. Downstairs I heard Lauren laugh again, the sound echoing lightly against the kitchen tile. I closed the lockbox and placed it gently into the suitcase. If they believed I was packing to leave, I would let them believe that a little longer. The next morning arrived with a thin gray light slipping through the curtains, the kind of quiet morning that used to belong to Thomas and me alone before the rest of the world woke up. I rose before 6, the way I had for decades, and made my way downstairs. The kitchen felt unfamiliar, not because anything had changed overnight, but because I knew I was being measured inside it. Lauren had already cleared a corner of the counter where my ceramic cookie jar used to sit. It now rested on a side shelf near the pantry, as if it had quietly been reassigned. I filled the kettle with water and set it on the stove. The soft click of the burner igniting sounded louder than usual. Daniel entered a few minutes later, dressed for work, tie slightly crooked. He looked surprised to see me at the table. "You are up early," he said. I almost smiled. I had been up early since before he could tie his own shoes. "Old habits," I replied. He poured himself coffee without asking if I wanted any. Lauren followed, scrolling through her phone, her expression focused and brisk. "I called a real estate agent," she announced casually, leaning against the counter. "Just to see what the market looks like. Houses in this neighborhood are going for over $400,000 now." I stirred my tea slowly. Thomas and I had purchased this house for $87,000 in 1983. We had painted every wall ourselves. We had measured every inch of carpet. Value meant something different to me. "That is interesting," I said evenly. Daniel cleared his throat. "It makes sense to think ahead," he added. "If you are moving out, we should not wait too long." "If you are moving out." The assumption hung in the air like steam from my cup. I nodded once and finished my tea. After they left for the day, the house settled into silence again. I carried my suitcase downstairs and placed it neatly by the front door where Lauren could see it when she returned. Then I picked up my purse and walked out into the cool morning air. The temperature hovered around 58 degrees, crisp enough to remind me that autumn was approaching. I drove 10 minutes to the local bank branch where Thomas and I had kept our accounts for years. The building looked exactly the same, red brick with large glass windows reflecting the street. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and carpet cleaner. I approached the counter and greeted the manager by name. "Good morning, Mrs. Collins," he said kindly. "I am sorry for your loss." I thanked him and asked to access our safe deposit box. He led me to the back room, where rows of small metal doors lined the wall like quiet sentinels. He handed me a key, and together we unlocked the box. I removed a thick manila envelope and placed it into my purse without opening it. The weight felt steady, intentional. Thomas had organized everything months ago, long before illness had taken hold. As I drove home, I passed the church where we had renewed our vows on our 30th anniversary. I remembered Thomas squeezing my hand afterward, whispering that he believed in preparation, not panic. Back at the house, I placed the envelope beside the metal lockbox in my suitcase. I did not rush. I did not rehearse what I would say. Down the hallway, the grandfather clock chimed noon, each note slow and deliberate. I walked into the living room and ran my hand along the back of Thomas's recliner. The fabric was worn where his arm used to rest. I stood there for a long moment, not in sorrow but in clarity. If they believed I was fragile, they would soon learn the difference between grief and weakness. That evening, Lauren came home carrying a folder with the logo of a real estate agency printed across the front in bold blue letters, and she placed it on the kitchen counter as if it were already a done deal. Daniel followed behind her, loosening his tie, his expression carefully neutral. I was seated at the dining table with a yellow legal pad in front of me, writing a short list in steady handwriting. Not a plea, not a goodbye, just names and dates. "The agent can come by Saturday," Lauren said, opening the folder and spreading papers across the counter. "She thinks we could list it within 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Thomas had spent 42 years inside these walls. I lifted my eyes and met Daniel's gaze. "That seems fast," I said calmly. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "The market is strong right now," he replied. "It is just practical." Practical had become the word of the week. I nodded once and returned to my list. Later, when they retreated to the living room to discuss square footage and curb appeal, I carried the metal lockbox and the envelope from the bank upstairs and closed the bedroom door behind me. The house felt divided now, as if 2 different futures were unfolding under the same roof. I sat at the edge of the bed and finally opened the manila envelope. Inside were copies of documents Thomas had signed nearly a year ago, long before his diagnosis became serious. His signature stretched across the bottom of each page in firm blue ink. I remembered the afternoon he returned from meeting with the attorney. He had set his briefcase down and looked at me with an expression that was both gentle and determined. "I believe in preparation," he had said, "not panic." At the time I told him I trusted him. I still did. I unfolded the first document and read each line carefully. The language was formal, precise, unmistakable. Certain assets were placed into a trust. Certain conditions were outlined. Certain protections were clear. My name appeared repeatedly. So did the address of this house. I did not smile. I did not rush downstairs to confront anyone. Instead, I folded the papers neatly and placed them back into the envelope. Outside, the wind brushed softly against the siding, and the oak tree swayed in slow arcs across the backyard. I walked to the window and watched the porch light flicker on as dusk settled in. In the reflection of the glass, I saw not a fragile widow, but a woman who had balanced household budgets through recessions, who had stretched grocery money to feed 3 people on a single income during lean years, who had stood beside her husband through every decision large and small. Downstairs, Lauren's voice rose again, animated, confident. She was explaining how a modern kitchen renovation could increase resale value by at least 10%. I closed my eyes briefly, recalling how Thomas once refused to replace the original cabinets because he said they were solid maple and built to last. Built to last. I placed the envelope back into the lockbox and locked it carefully. Then I carried it to the closet and returned it to the top shelf behind the photo albums. When I stepped back into the hallway, I could hear Daniel laughing softly at something Lauren had said. It was not cruel laughter. It was comfortable. Certain. I descended the stairs slowly, one hand gliding along the banister. "I will be out of your way soon," I said evenly when I reached the bottom step. Lauren looked relieved. Daniel nodded. They believed the conversation was settled. They believed I was accepting the inevitable. I moved past them into the kitchen and turned off the overhead light above the sink. The room dimmed, leaving only the warm glow from the lamp in the corner. Some conversations do not require raised voices. Some decisions do not need witnesses. And some preparations take time. Saturday morning arrived with clear skies and a thin layer of frost still clinging to the edges of the lawn, and I woke before the alarm clock even had the chance to sound. The house felt alert, as if it knew strangers were expected to walk through it and measure its worth in square footage and updated fixtures. I dressed carefully in a navy sweater and pressed slacks. Nothing dramatic, nothing confrontational. Downstairs, Lauren was already rearranging decorative pillows on the couch, her movements brisk and purposeful. Daniel stood near the front window, glancing at his watch. "The agent will be here at 10, Lauren said without looking at me. "It would help if the place feels neutral." Neutral. I looked around at the framed family photographs still lining the hallway and wondered which memories counted as clutter. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a cup of coffee, the familiar weight of the mug grounding in my hands. "I invited someone as well," I said evenly. Lauren paused mid-step. "Invited who?" she asked, a slight edge creeping into her voice. "An attorney," I replied. "There are details we should all understand before anyone starts measuring the living room." Daniel frowned slightly. "Mom, we already talked about this," he said. "There is nothing complicated." I met his eyes steadily. There rarely is until there is. At precisely 10 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Lauren moved quickly, smoothing her hair before opening the door to greet a woman in a tailored gray coat carrying a leather portfolio. They exchanged pleasantries, discussing comparable properties in the neighborhood and recent sale prices. The agent stepped inside and began noting the open floor plan, the hardwood floors, the natural light from the east-facing windows. I remained at the dining table listening. A second knock followed 5 minutes later. Daniel looked confused, but I rose and answered it myself. Mr. Henderson stood on the porch, briefcase in hand, his expression professional and composed. "Good morning, Mrs. Collins," he said warmly. "I trust you are well." "As well as can be expected," I replied, stepping aside to let him in. Lauren's smile faltered when she saw him. "What is this?" she asked. The real estate agent paused in the hallway, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. I gestured toward the dining table. "Before any listing agreement is signed," I said calmly, "we should review the ownership structure of this property." Daniel exhaled sharply. "Mom, that is not necessary." Mr. Henderson placed his briefcase on the table and opened it with deliberate care. "Actually," he said, removing a set of documents clipped neatly together, "it is very necessary." Lauren crossed her arms. "Daniel inherited the house," she stated confidently. Mr. Henderson adjusted his glasses and slid the first page across the table. "According to the trust established last year by Mr. Thomas Collins," he said, his tone measured, "the property located at this address was transferred into a revocable living trust, with Mrs. Margaret Collins as the sole lifetime beneficiary and trustee." Silence settled heavily in the room. The real estate agent looked down at her folder, suddenly less certain. Daniel stared at the page as if the words might rearrange themselves. Lauren's expression shifted from certainty to disbelief. "That cannot be right," she said quietly. I rested my hands lightly on the back of a dining chair. "Your father believed in preparation," I said to Daniel, not unkindly. "He did not want panic-guiding decisions." Mr. Henderson continued, outlining the specific clause that required my consent for any sale or transfer of the property, and clarified that no listing could proceed without my signature. The agent slowly closed her portfolio. The frost outside had begun to melt, thin rivulets of water tracing lines along the driveway. Inside, the air felt different now, not tense but recalibrated. I did not raise my voice. I did not celebrate. I simply looked at my son and his wife and said, "It appears there are still details to consider." The silence after Mr. Henderson finished speaking did not break all at once. It thinned slowly, like fog lifting off the lake at dawn. The real estate agent gathered her papers with careful hands and offered a polite apology for the misunderstanding before stepping out onto the porch. Lauren did not walk her to the door. Daniel remained seated at the table, staring at the trust document as if it had personally offended him. Mr. Henderson closed his briefcase with a soft click and looked at me. "If you need anything further, Mrs. Collins, please call my office," he said. I thanked him, and after he left, the front door shut with a sound that echoed longer than usual. Lauren was the first to speak. "Why did you not tell us?" she asked, her voice tight but controlled. I folded my hands in front of me. "You did not ask," I replied. Daniel finally looked. "Dad would have talked to me about this," he said, though there was less certainty in his tone than before. I held his gaze steadily. "Your father believed in protecting what he built," I said. "And he believed in protecting me." No one raised their voice. No one stormed out. The confrontation was quieter than that. It was the kind that shifts power without theatrics. Lauren moved toward the kitchen and began wiping an already clean counter, her motions sharp. "This changes things," she said. "Yes," I answered. "It does." Daniel ran a hand through his hair. "So what happens now?" he asked. The question lingered between us. I rose from my chair and walked to the window, looking out at the oak tree swaying gently in the breeze. "Now," I said, "we talk about reality instead of assumptions." I turned back toward them. "The house remains in the trust. I am the trustee. Any decision about selling or transferring it requires my approval." Lauren crossed her arms. "You are not going to sell," she said, more statement than question. I met her eyes calmly. "I am not making any decisions today," I replied. "Grief is not a sound foundation for major financial choices." Daniel exhaled slowly, as if absorbing the weight of that sentence. The suitcase still stood near the front door where I had placed it days earlier. Lauren's gaze flicked toward it, then back to me. "So you are not leaving," she said. I considered the phrasing carefully. "I am not being removed," I answered. "There is a difference." The afternoon light filtered through the living room curtains, casting long, steady beams across the hardwood floor Thomas had insisted on installing despite the extra cost. Built to last. I walked to the dining table and gathered the copies of the trust documents, aligning the edges neatly before placing them back into their envelope. "We can revisit the idea of selling at a later time," I continued, my tone even. "But it will be a discussion, not a directive." Daniel nodded slowly. Lauren did not respond. For the first time since the funeral, the air in the house felt balanced. Not warm, not comfortable, but balanced. I picked up my coffee mug from the counter and rinsed it in the sink, the water running steady and clear. Behind me, Daniel spoke again, quieter now. "Mom, I did not know." I turned off the faucet and faced him. "I know," I said. "And I did." Ignorance and intent are not always the same. Lauren stepped toward the hallway, her heels clicking against the wood floor. "We need to think," she said to Daniel, "about everything." They retreated upstairs, their voices low and indistinct. I remained in the kitchen, listening to the familiar hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock above the stove. The house did not feel like it was slipping away anymore. It felt anchored. I walked to the front door and gently moved the suitcase away from it, placing it against the wall near the staircase. I did not unpack it yet. Preparation, I had learned, does not end when the papers are signed. It simply changes direction. The house remained unusually quiet the next morning. Not tense, not hostile, but recalculating. I could feel it in the way footsteps upstairs paused before crossing the hallway, in the way cabinet doors were closed more softly than usual. Daniel left early for work without his usual cup of coffee, offering only a brief, distracted goodbye. Lauren lingered at the kitchen island, scrolling through her phone, her posture rigid. I prepared breakfast the way I always had, 2 slices of toast and a bowl of oatmeal measured carefully with a half-cup scoop. Routine has a way of steadying the mind. "We need to talk about logistics," Lauren said finally, setting her phone down. I looked up from the stove. "Logistics require clarity," I replied. "We are closer to that now." She exhaled slowly. "Daniel and I moved in to help," she said. "After your surgery last year. After Dad got sick. We did not expect this to turn into a legal standoff." I turned off the burner and faced her fully. Neither did I answered. But assumptions created this situation, not documents. She held my gaze for a moment, then looked away. Later that afternoon, Daniel returned home earlier than usual. He asked if we could sit down together in the living room. I agreed. We took our seats in a triangle, the same arrangement we used during holiday gatherings when discussing travel plans or school decisions. The sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow over Thomas's recliner, still positioned at its familiar angle toward the television. I spoke to a financial advisor. Daniel began carefully. He confirmed what the attorney said. The trust is valid. I nodded once. Your father was thorough, I said. Daniel swallowed. He did not tell me, he admitted. Maybe he thought I would misunderstand. The honesty in his voice softened something in me, but not enough to shift my resolve. He wanted stability, I said. For everyone. Lauren leaned forward slightly. So what are you saying? She asked. That we have no say at all? I folded my hands in my lap. I am saying that this house is not a bargaining chip, I replied. It is not leverage. It is not a transaction to be rushed because the market is favorable. Silence followed. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, each second deliberate. Daniel looked around the room as if seeing it differently for the first time. What do you want, Mom? He asked quietly. The question mattered. I considered it carefully before answering. I want respect, I said. And time. I will not be pushed out of my home under the pressure of convenience. Lauren's shoulders tightened. We were not trying to push you, she said, though the words lacked conviction. I did not argue. I simply held her gaze until she lowered it. We can create an arrangement that works for all of us, I continued. But it will begin with acknowledgement. Daniel nodded slowly. We moved too fast, he admitted. The room felt lighter after that. Not repaired. Not healed. But honest. I rose from my seat and walked to the staircase where the suitcase still rested against the wall. I lifted it and carried it upstairs, placing it back inside the bedroom closet. Not unpacked. Just repositioned. When I returned downstairs, Daniel was standing near the front window, looking out at the oak tree swaying gently in the late afternoon breeze. Dad really did think of everything, he said quietly. I joined him at the window. He thought of what might happen, I replied. And he made sure I would not be left unprotected. The house did not feel divided anymore. It felt claimed. Not through anger. Not through confrontation. But through clarity. And clarity has a way of settling into the walls, reminding everyone exactly where they stand. The following week unfolded with a different rhythm inside the house, quieter but more deliberate, as if every movement now carried awareness. Daniel began staying later at work, returning home after 7 in the evening, his shoulders slightly slumped, his voice subdued. Lauren moved through the rooms with measured steps, no longer rearranging furniture or discussing renovation ideas. The real estate folder disappeared from the kitchen counter. In its place sat a stack of unopened mail and a small vase of white carnations someone had sent after the funeral. I kept to my routines, waking before sunrise, walking half a mile around the neighborhood when the weather allowed, preparing meals without asking who would be at the table. Grief still lived in the corners of the house, but it no longer felt tangled with uncertainty. One afternoon, Daniel knocked softly on my bedroom door. Do you have a minute? He asked. I invited him in. He stood near the dresser where framed photographs lined the surface, his eyes lingering on one from his high school graduation. I have been thinking, he said slowly. Lauren and I may have rushed into this. We assumed things would naturally pass to us. We did not stop to consider what that meant for you. I listened without interrupting. Silence can be more instructive than correction. I never wanted you to feel displaced, he continued. I just thought it would be easier if we all moved forward quickly. I folded a sweater and placed it neatly in the drawer before responding. Moving forward does not require erasing what came before, I said gently. This home holds history. It deserves careful decisions. He nodded, absorbing the weight of that sentence. Later that evening, Lauren joined us in the living room. She sat upright on the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I owe you an apology, she said, her voice controlled but sincere. I let numbers and timing guide me. I forgot this was your home long before it was ours. The words did not erase the past week, but they shifted something essential. I studied her expression and saw less defensiveness, more awareness. Thank you, I replied simply. Respect begins with acknowledgement. We discussed practical arrangements after that. Contributions to utilities. Shared responsibilities. Boundaries. No raised voices. No accusations. Just terms spoken clearly and agreed upon with intention. The trust documents remained in place, untouched, but their presence changed the dynamic. They were no longer a weapon or a shield. They were structure. A framework that reminded everyone where authority rested and why. That night, after they went upstairs, I remained in the living room alone. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times, each note resonating through the quiet space. I walked to Thomas's recliner and rested my hand on its worn armrest. He had prepared for this moment not because he expected conflict, but because he understood human nature. When stability is assumed, gratitude fades. When security is threatened, character reveals itself. I turned off the lamp beside his chair and stood in the dim glow of the hallway light. The house felt steady. Not triumphant. Not divided. Steady. The oak tree outside cast long shadows across the lawn under the porch light, its branches unmoved by small gusts of wind. Built to last. I understood now that protection is not about control. It is about clarity. And clarity, once established, does not shout. It settles into the walls and reminds everyone exactly where the foundation stands. Winter arrived quietly that year. The first snow settling over the lawn in a thin white layer that softened the edges of everything it touched. I stood at the front window early one morning and watched as Daniel brushed frost from his windshield, his movements slower than they had been weeks before. Inside the house, the air felt warmer, steadier. Not because circumstances had reversed overnight, but because understanding had taken root where assumption once stood. The suitcase remained in the closet upstairs, unopened but no longer symbolic of exile. It had become a reminder instead, a quiet witness to how quickly security can be tested. That evening, Daniel and Lauren invited me to sit with them at the dining table, the same table where everything had shifted. Lauren placed 3 mugs of tea in front of us before taking her seat. We have been talking, she began carefully, about finding a place of our own. Daniel nodded. Not because we have to, he added quickly, but because it might be healthier for everyone. I listened without interruption. The oak tree outside the window swayed gently in the wind, its branches stronger now against the colder air. This house has always been yours, Daniel continued. We forgot that. We treated it like an inheritance instead of a home. I met his eyes. There was no defensiveness left in them, only recognition. Lauren exhaled softly. I let urgency guide me, she said. I saw opportunity. I did not see attachment. Her honesty carried more weight than any apology spoken in haste. I folded my hands together on the table. Attachment is not weakness, I said calmly. It is memory. It is work. It is years of sacrifice you cannot measure in market value. No one argued. No one rushed to fill the silence. The decision to move did not feel like defeat on their part, nor victory on mine. It felt appropriate. In the weeks that followed, they began searching for a townhouse closer to Daniel's office. Listings were discussed openly this time. Finances were reviewed carefully. And when they found a modest place 20 minutes away, I attended the closing with them at Daniel's request. I watched as he signed his name on the final document, his hand steady. Ownership earned carries a different weight than ownership assumed. On the morning they moved out, the driveway filled with cardboard boxes and a rented truck. Lauren approached me before climbing into the passenger seat. Thank you, she said quietly, for not reacting the way I would have. I considered her words. Strength does not need to raise its voice, I replied. Daniel hugged me longer than usual. Dad would have been proud, he said. I smiled gently. He was prepared, I answered. That is different. When their car disappeared down the street, the house grew still again. Not empty. Not lonely. Just still. I walked through each room slowly, touching the back of chairs, the edge of countertops, the banister polished by decades of hands. The grandfather clock chimed noon, its sound full and certain. I stepped onto the cedar deck Thomas built and looked at the oak trees standing firm against the winter sky. Built to last. I understood then that protection is not about possession. It is about preserving dignity when it is tested. I had not shouted. I had not demanded. I had simply stood where I belonged. And in doing so, I reminded everyone else where they stood as well.